Evening to everyone in China. Let me begin by giving you some headline news uh, live from Washington. I don't know if any of you have heard, but President Trump has reorganized his campaign team. He has demoted his campaign manager and brought on a new man. Names don't really matter here, but this new campaign manager worked for John McCain's campaign, George W. Bush's campaign, and also for Governor Christie. President Trump did this because he was very disappointed with his Tulsa rally, and his poll numbers are sinking across the country. Biden's is certainly by poll numbers is well ahead of him. And an astounding 64% of Americans rate President Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic negatively, 64%. So the coronavirus has in some ways transformed the 2020 elections, but November is still some time away, and we'll see what happens. So now let me move to today's program. The U.S.-China Education Trust has taken U.S. presidential elections to China since 2000. COVID-19, of course, has made this impossible for the 2020 elections. So we're thrilled to be working with AmCham China to continue USET election programs virtually. Today we have a terrific lineup of Washington-based speakers to discuss your pocketbook, economics, trade, and business implications for U.S. presidential elections. Voting your pocketbook is something of an American truism. James Carville, a campaign strategist for Bill Clinton, put it more succinctly. The slogan was, "It's the economy, stupid." Well, if we're going to go by the economy, that does not look good for President Trump, as the coronavirus pandemic has very much negatively impacted economies around the world, including the U.S. So will Americans vote to primarily benefit themselves financially in 2020, given the unpredictability of these unprecedented times? We will find out from our speakers, but one thing is for certain: China will be front and center in this election, with Trump and Joe Biden, the Democratic presumptive nominee, trying to out-hawk each other on China in the campaign. So we can expect a lively discussion today to be moderated by AmCham China President Alan Beebe. You already have the bios of our speakers to give us as much time as possible to take your questions and for discussion. Let me just say that you can't have three more brilliant, expert, and connected speakers than the three speakers we have today. They will give you the inside scoop on the economic predictors of the upcoming US elections. And they are Amy Jellicoe, who leads the China team at Albright Stonebridge Group, Bill Wrench, former president of the National Foreign Trade Council, and Bob Davis, senior editor at the Wall Street Journal and co-author of a new book, Superpower Showdown: How the Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatens a New Cold War. He co-authored a book with Wei Ling, and it's billed as the inside story of the US-China trade war. We are not adverse to promoting the books of our speakers, and most of our speakers have had many publications. Anyway, time is short. Let me turn the mic to Al. Al, it's all yours.
Great. Well, good evening from Beijing, Ambassador Block and your team, and good morning to you. First, I would just like to thank you for making this evening's event possible, and in fact, our broader partnership possible with the U.S.-China Education Trust. And we are so pleased to have such a distinguished group of participants here today. Of course, our speakers and panelists, but also we have a very eclectic group of people who have registered and joining today's event, and nearly 100, people that are coming from both the USCET scholar community as well as from the AmCham China member community. So, and just for those of you who may not be familiar with AmCham China, I thought I would just spend a moment just to give you a little bit of background and context. We are a nonprofit, non-governmental organization with a history of over a century. In fact, we just celebrated our 100th year anniversary, since our first establishment in China back in 1919. And we're the only officially recognized chamber of commerce that represent American business on the mainland. And essentially, we are serving our member companies. We have nearly 1,000 companies from across industries, many of those who are with us here this evening. And we provide a whole range of advocacy, information, and networking, services. As you can imagine, our job in terms of helping our American member companies succeed in China and to serve as a constructive bridge in the U.S.-China relationship has become more challenging and perhaps ever more relevant, during these last few years. So I'm so pleased that we have this opportunity, to bring insights, unique insights, from Washington and from our American colleagues here this evening. And Ambassador Block, just as you had mentioned in our feature magazine, we have a magazine called The Quarterly, and where we highlighted you last year, that you had mentioned that cultural and other types of exchanges between the U.S. and China are really the pillar in terms of building mutual understanding and trust. And it's suffice to say that that pillar is being really challenged these days. It hasn't quite cracked, as you so eloquently stated, but there are fractures. So what we hope to do here, this evening and through this series that we have in the run-up with you to the presidential elections is to try and bridge that understanding, between our countries. The level of interest, I would say, from our member community for tonight's session has been extraordinarily high. We have fielded many questions in advance, and when we go through the panel discussion and my moderation of the Q&A session, I'll be certain to raise some of those questions. But as we get into that, we'll of course take questions from our audience. But before we get things formally kicked off, Ambassador Block, I would just like to present you, and I wish I could do this in person, with a honorary membership with AmCham China. We'll be sending this by FedEx or Xunfeng. It should be reaching you shortly, but I just wanted to use that as, a symbol of our appreciation for all of your service over the years, and what you are doing with USCET as an institution, but really at a personal level, aligns so closely with our vision and our mission and our mandate. So thank you very much. And with that, I would like to maybe just turn things back over to you to introduce our speakers a little bit more, and then we'll jump right into the program.
Okay, I think I'm still on. Well, Al, first of all, I am really privileged and delighted to accept this honorary membership. I really don't want to take up too much time, and I think people already know our distinguished speakers. So I think that they can read their bios for more, but let me just say that at a time when the U.S.-China relationship is really at its worst since the normalization relations in 1979, AmCham China is needed more than ever. If U.S.-China relations are going to normalize or stabilize, then AmCham would have to be at the heart of the recovery. AmCham China is needed to improve the business environment in China, to help American companies succeed in China, and provide a focal point for the foreign business community to advance U.S.-China relations. And you, Al, and AmCham China, and all your colleagues and your members are at the heart of that. So really, our speakers are known. So let us move on. But those of you who want more information, please look at the bios that we have sent you. And so let's really move forthwith to our speakers. I believe we're going to start with Bill Wrench, correct?
That is correct. And okay. I think each of our speakers will have roughly 15 minutes, to kind of present their views and opinions. And one of my duties this evening will be the role of timekeeper. If we exceed the time, then I'll kind of politely, encourage you to wrap up. So, Bill, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's really a pleasure to join all of you. I've had the privilege in the past of both meeting actually in person with AmCham members, both in Beijing, but also when they come back to Washington for their annual door knock, which I hope they'll resume when it's safe to do so. But I'm happy to do it virtually this time as well. And it's a timely event. We have an election coming up, as you know, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. I have a few slides just for entertainment purposes, so if we could put those on the screen, put the first one on the screen, that would be a good thing. Yes, if you can make it a little bit bigger, excellent. Obviously, I think the main issue in American elections is almost always the economy. And this year it will certainly be the economy, and it will be the economy as defined by COVID. And it will hinge, I think, on where we stand in October and September and October, and what the trend line is. Is the pandemic in the United States getting better? Is it getting worse? Is the recovery underway? Is the recovery pretty clear it's not going to be V-shaped in the United States? We can see that already. If it were going to be V-shaped, we would be well into the upward trajectory right now. Economists have started to talk about different letters, W, U, and different symbols. A check mark or a reverse check mark seems to be the popular one right now, that there's been a sharp drop in economic activity and that there will be probably thinking about a check mark, a slow recovery, and perhaps not to the same level as we were when things began. Both the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and also the OECD, as I recall, have projected in the case of most countries, but particularly in the case of the United States, that growth will return faster than employment, and that unemployment in the United States will continue to lag. They are projecting in something in the more than 8% range by the end of this year, and some of them I think even higher than that by the end of this year. And that was a projection that was made when things were looking better a couple months ago. So, and it's things like the unemployment rate that have a big influence on the election. So you can expect that to be the defining issue. You can expect the president to evade responsibility for anything that's happened. It's bad. And to remind everybody of how strong the economy was before COVID struck. But you should also, I think, put the larger debate into context, and particularly for this audience, we want to talk a little bit about trade and its relevance to the election, along with other issues. And this chart, I think, is a very revealing one, because it tells you, and as you'll see in subsequent slides, that people have opinions about trade. But if you ask a different question, namely what's important, You see the trade is usually at the bottom of the list. It's usually number 7, or actually, if you look at the 2019 data on this chart, it's actually slipped to number 8. The things that Americans tend to care about when they vote are terrorism, the economy, and healthcare. And they tend to rotate between which one is number 1, which number 1 is number 2, and which one is number 3. But they're the big 3. I think right now, if you did a 2020 poll here, strengthening the nation's economy would be much higher than 70%. And it would be, it's number 1 in last year, but I think it would be far and away number 1 this year. But number 2 and 3 would probably be still the same. And trade would be down there with climate change, which is on the upswing, but still near the bottom. So it's not really a dispositive issue when people vote, but it is something they have opinions about. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the sort of gross opinion. And there, this is, the general public, you have favorable views about trade, and the light green line is yes, and the dark, I guess, black line is no. And you can see the trend line here is very clear. Americans are pro-trade, and they've pretty consistently been pro-trade. Now, as we'll see in later slides, this is a case in part of cognitive dissonance. Americans are perfectly capable of believing contradictory things at the same time. And while they are pro-trade, this does not stop them from telling pollsters that trade has a variety of bad effects. And we'll get to those in the beginning. But if you ask the general question, is trade a good thing? Is it an opportunity? What you get from not only a very large percentage of Americans, but a growing percentage of Americans is the answer to that is yes. So if you look at the next slide, however, you see that there's partisan differences. And this brings you back to the election. The chart on the left is everybody. The chart on the right is the Democrats. And the most interesting chart is the one in the middle, which is the Republicans. It may surprise you to see the chart on the right. The Democrats have been consistently positive about trade and increasingly pro-trade. And there's a reason for that, which will be revealed shortly. The Republicans have flip-flopped on trade. Historically, they've been the party of basically international big business, party of the people that represent a lot of the companies that are probably participating in this webinar. But then you see a nosedive in terms of Republican support for trade that coincided with Donald Trump's entry into the presidential contest and troughed really in 2016. And you see it's begun to recover since then. And that Republicans with a favorable view of trade are starting to come back. But it is way below the Democrats' level, and it is running roughly even with the Republicans that continue to have an unfavorable view about trade, really following the lead of their president. So let's look at the next slide, and this will tell you a little bit about why that is so. Well, this is a digression. Before we get to that one, this is a slide that talks about steel tariffs, which I found quite interesting, because steel and aluminum, because it kind of reflects the partisanship that's going on in Washington right now. That while on the top part you can see that both parties, as reflected in the previous slide, tend to be pro-trade to different degrees. If you look at tariffs, you find that basically the Republicans support them, the Democrats don't. The dirty little secret about this slide is that if President Obama had imposed the tariffs, you'd get the same percentages, but the parties would be reversed. The Democrats would support them because Obama did them, and the Republicans would oppose them because Obama did them. Currently, the Republicans support them because Trump did them, and the Democrats oppose them because Trump did them. And a lot of this is following your party's leader. Now, if you look at the next slide, this gets back to my more central point. Basically, the Democrats are pro-trade because if you look at this chart, the people in our country that are most pro-trade, most pro-globalization, I'm not showing that chart in the interest of time, are young people and minorities. And that's the Democratic base. And that tells you a lot about why the Democratic Party as a whole is where it is. At the same time, the Democratic Party has a significant element of organized labor which has long been skeptical about trade. And what this shows us is that there's kind of a disjuncture in politics in America right now, in the sense that American elected officials, American politicians, and the Democratic Party are much less pro-trade than Democratic voters, whereas in the Republican Party it's the reverse. Republican elected officials, Republican politicians are much more pro-trade than their voters. And the reason, frankly, has a lot to do with financial and political support. Democratic candidates get substantial support, not only financial, but organizational support from organized labor. Organized labor mans the phone banks. They canvass voters. They drive people to the polls. They run get out the vote campaigns. They are a hugely important part of the democratic machinery that tries to win elections. Republicans, in contrast, get enormous financial support from business, from the Chamber of Commerce, from local chambers of commerce. Don't want to speak for the AmCham here, but from business, both small and large. And candidates at the congressional level, at the senatorial level, and the local level reflects where that support comes from. So this is why you find Republican candidates at lower levels are inherently much more pro-trade than the president and much more pro-trade than their party in their hearts. In their votes, you don't see that because there's a real disincentive in the current climate to standing up to the president. You get a nasty tweet, and the fact is the Republican base right now is the president's base, and the president has around, I think in the latest poll, 89% approval amongst Republicans. So if you're a Republican down the ballot, you challenge him at your peril because his supporters are your supporters, and if you go up against him, you're asking for trouble. So that's the divide that we have right now. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is the disjuncture issue that I mentioned earlier. Basically, this is a chart that says, well, people like trade. They're cognizant of the fact that it has problems, that basically that some things hurt Americans, that outsourcing, offshoring hurts Americans. Basically, the second bar tells you that what should be obvious to everybody: imports are bad. The second bar from the bottom tells you the opposite: imports are good. It tells you that immigrants don't help things in the opinion of Americans. That union membership is hurt by trade. Let's go to the next slide that will amplify on some of this. And you can see here that while there are positive responses, if you look at the last line, the number of people that think that trade helps jobs is lower than most other things here. So this is the divide that we have in America. This is the divide that we've often had in America on international economics and globalization. Historically, this is a divide that fades in the general election because most of the time both parties nominate a candidate that moves to the center, and both candidates defend their base, but they move to the center to attract the 20-odd% of voters in the middle that are either undecided or independent. It's long been an axiom in American politics that Donald Duck could get 40% on the Republican ballot, Mickey Mouse could get 40% on the Democratic ballot, and the election is really fought for the 20% that's in between. And that's no different this time around, but what the difference is, we have a president that's not moving to the middle. We have a president who's taken extraordinary steps to protect his base. And one of the things that will happen, therefore, is that trade is not going to phase as an issue in the election because our president cares about trade. It's a signature issue for the president on trade. He believes he has significant victories on trade, and he's going to spend the election talking about those victories. USMCA is one of them, and it is a victory that he can talk about. He can trash the NAFTA agreement, talk about USMCA. He will also talk about his China victory. That's a little bit harder, but phase one is a victory. And he will have significant backing behind him because of the shift in public opinion on China questions. And that's the last slide, if we can turn to that one. You'll see that what's happened has been a sharp turn in just the last few years in terms of unfavorable American opinion about China. And what this has led to in political terms is really solidarity on the part of the two parties on China. Both of them are taking a very hardline anti-China position right now. Both of them are impelled to do that because of the public opinion that you can see here. There are differences. While both of them will, both candidates will spend the campaign beating each other over the head as being soft on China. Trump did that to Biden just yesterday, or I guess the day before yesterday, in his Rose Garden press conference that veered off into many directions, but one of them was that Biden was soft on China. And you'll see Biden saying the same thing about Trump, and they can get away with it because they both have evidence. Both candidates have, from time to time, said and done things that expose them to that charge. And you can see from the last slide here that it's a charge that resonates with the public. So what you'll find, though, is a difference in the way that anti-China-ness, if you wish, is manifest. And basically what you'll find the president saying is that I'm the only one that's been smart enough to stand up to the Chinese, and I made this phase 1 deal, and if I'm reelected, we'll make a phase 2 deal and we'll solve all the problems. The Biden campaign will say what they'll say on a lot of things about the president, which is right diagnosis, wrong prescription. You've got the problem correct. Your Section 301 analysis of what the Chinese are doing that is bad for us, actually bad for them if you look at it from the standpoint of growth, was correct, but you've chosen to address that problem in a way that is both failing, counterproductive, and producing enormous amounts of collateral damage in terms of not only the farmers, but the manufacturers in the United States that you're hurting with your tariffs. Biden has not answered and will not answer the question of what he would do about the tariffs when he comes into office. I think I can tell you what he'll do about them, but we'll save that for Q&A. But you know, basically the lines are drawn. Both of them are going to take a hard line because of the shift in public opinion, which I would attribute, frankly, less to President Trump and more to the policies that the Chinese government is pursuing over the last several years. And the argument will be not over what they're doing and why it's bad, but what should be done about it. And there the candidates will diverge, and there the election will be fought on trade terms. But going back to the beginning, the real issue will be the health of the economy overall. And trade, I think, at the end of the day, is not going to be a decisive factor. And with that, I'll stop, Julia, and turn it back to you and my two colleagues.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill. And I think Julia might be on mute there. But those are, you know, just to sort of sum up. Well, first, now I understand, you know, why we titled today's session, you know, Vote with Your Pocketbook. You know, so I think that first slide that you have was very telling, just in terms of what actually matters to voters. And it is all about the economy. And seems that will be ever more so the case. Why don't we go ahead and turn things over to Amy, you know, to build on Bill's great comments there. Amy?
Thanks so much, Alan, to you and to Julia for inviting me to participate in this discussion on the U.S. election season. I think it's always really interesting to watch American politics, but this year for China-focused people more so and more consequential than ever before. And so I'll focus my remarks, as you just noted, Alan, on the issue of U.S.-China trade specifically as a factor or a non-factor in this fall's election. I thought I would quickly do a run through of the recent history in our trade relationship before addressing what this means for trade issues in this year's election campaigns. And for all of us who work on US-China trade issues, what a roller coaster it's been. Remember the days, the years, in fact, when the US-China commercial relationship was referred to as the ballast, the stabilizer of the overall US-China relationship. despite disagreements on a whole host of geostrategic and political issues, and of course the natural tensions between democratic and socialist countries, despite crises that have erupted over the prior 38 years since normalization. The fact that our trade and investment ties were growing with China, that there were winners in both countries from enhanced trade and investment ties, these issues have been incredibly important in stabilizing our broader US-China relationship. Through all those times of ups and downs, the American business community and AmCham very loudly could make a convincing case for the tangible benefits of engagement with China, even when our officials in Beijing and Washington didn't have the ability or the desire to overcome tensions and growing distrust between our two governments. But unfortunately, what we're seeing this year is that those days really are over. And commercial ties between the United States and China have gone from being a stabilizer to becoming a leading source of instability in the relationship. Most acutely when the trade war began between the two countries in 2018. The Trump administration, whose campaign 4 years ago during the last presidential election season often cited the unfairness in our trading relationship with China, exemplified by our significant trade deficit. Trump came into office saying that he as president was going to tackle economic and trade issues with China, which his Republican and Democratic predecessors had failed to do. And as everyone recalls, the Trump administration began by canceling high-level dialogues that had been begun by prior administrations, the JCCT, the SED, the SNED, with accusations that these had been just talk sessions, heavy on process and light on results, due mainly to Chinese foot dragging. And the president began his own high-level dialogue, and of course had his VVIP state visit to Beijing in the fall of 2017. But in 2018, that's when the real change in our trade relationship began. The famous tweet was, "Trade wars are good and easy to win," that President Trump wrote in March of 2018 when he announced those steel and aluminum tariffs that Bill just cited. Tariffs not just on China, but of course on all our major trading partners. And then, of course, USTR homed in on China with Section 301 tariffs, targeting China's failure to live up to its longstanding commitments to enhance protection of intellectual property, level the playing field for American and other foreign investors, and stop the distorting impact of China's unfair trade practices on global markets. And while this blunt tool of tariffs to force China to the negotiating table was certainly unpopular among many of us in the business community, there was a strong sense of promise fatigue, as we all know and live day in and day out, over some unwillingness by the Chinese side to actually live up to the commitments it had made to open up its markets to foreign investors, not just American ones. And so we in the business community, I think many of us resigned ourselves to a reluctant willingness to support the Trump administration's tactics to see if real change could be pushed through these past 2 years of trade negotiations. And our trade issues during this time became increasingly contentious as more and more national security issues bled into our commercial and trade issues. And both Washington and Beijing continue to adopt more strident and confrontational policies, not just to deal with trade imbalances, but also to promote some economic decoupling between our two countries, particularly due to national security concerns around technology. This growing US-China economic rivalry was set to shape markets, global supply chains, innovation, investment decisions, and the norms and the rules of global governance for years to come, which made the stakes of the trade negotiations even more important. So I think it's fair to say that many of us in the business community breathed at least a temporary sigh of relief in January when there was an agreement announced between the United States and China, the Phase 1 trade agreement. And while this agreement was limited in scope, it was real, and there was positive movement on issues that had been plaguing the relationship in the commercial sense. There was codifying Chinese promises to improve IP enforcement, of course, some major purchase commitments, and some movement on removing market access barriers. And of course, for all of us, halting more tariffs and even some removal of tariffs. AmCham, of course, was absolutely right to join a whole host of other business groups just a week ago in sending a letter to Ambassador Lighthizer, Secretary Mnuchin, and Vice Premier Liu He, highlighting the importance of this agreement and pushing for its continued implementation despite the increasing tensions in the relationship. But 2020 has brought into sharp focus for many the full extent of the growing rivalry between the United States and China in areas that extend well beyond the trade relationship. And I think it's probably fair to characterize COVID-19 as a catalyst for hardening views in both our countries against the other. As has been widely cited, in April, Pew Research poll found that roughly 2/3 of Americans now have a negative opinion of China. This is the highest percentage recorded since Pew Research began asking this question in 2005. Only about a quarter of the respondents in the US reported a favorable attitude towards China. There are many in Beijing and in Washington, and I'll count myself among this group, who want to continue to highlight the positive aspects of the limited Phase 1 trade agreement on the overall relationship to try to mitigate some of the massive risks in this relationship in free fall, which we now face. But this is incredibly difficult to do in any campaign season, particularly this year's campaign season. And I think, just picking up where Bill left off, I think while President Trump certainly will want to cite his successes in negotiating a trade agreement with China, I don't think he can rely too much talking in a forward-leaning way about what he wants to do to continue to negotiate with China. Because unfortunately, touting the benefits of trade with China is not the tack that's being taken by the Trump or the Biden campaign this year. US-China trade issues aren't at the forefront of election politics. Demonizing China is at the forefront of election politics. Both campaigns are focused on the considerable uncertainty that exists about how US-China relations will evolve in this new era of increased competition, and the impact of China's behavior on American national security and American competitiveness in the global markets. 4 years ago, the Trump and Clinton campaigns were united in their concerns over the plight of American workers due to the downsides of globalization. Both candidates opposed TPP, as we well remember, because that agreement could have adversely impacted American workers. Our economy was strong then, and we were focused on unfairness. And President Trump came into office to address that unfairness by withdrawing from US trade agreements that he said were unfair and rebalancing trade relationships to benefit the United States. But it's not enough this year to win voters to focus on those issues. This year, we're in a global recession, a public health crisis in the United States and many parts of the world. As a Republican strategist here in Washington has said, 2 of the top 3 issues for American voters in this campaign season, as we've said at the top of this program, are the economy and the handling of coronavirus. The third issue is China, because China is tied to both of those issues. And both of these issues in a way that China is a problem and that is harming US interests, both our economic interests and of course our public health, rightly or wrongly. Unfortunately, that is what we're looking at this fall. So while I will continue to tout the benefits of upholding a Phase 1 trade agreement with China, I think that I'm doubtful that this will be a major issue in election politics. Instead, what will be a major issue is a bilateral relationship in free fall and very little optimism that the relationship is going to stabilize in November. I'm sorry to conclude by being so pessimistic that both candidates think they can score more points with voters by focusing on the need to get tough on China, not just due to pocketbook issues, but to serve even broader American interests. But in this environment, this is why we need to look beyond November and think about how this rhetoric in the campaign will translate into policy. So just to conclude, I am very pessimistic about the outlook of how we can talk about China rationally during the next 5 months. I am not pessimistic about the outlook for the United States to think about shifting our policies in a more positive direction starting in 2021. And I'll point to Bill Burns' article in The Atlantic that he just published, talking about the need for the United States to have a new foreign policy that reinvents how we deal with major global issues, including a more competitive relationship with China. But I'll stop there and allow the next expert to talk about what's to come.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Amy. I think you've given me a lot to think about in your remarks, and just a little bit of an advertisement here. We're with you in the camp that a positive U.S.-China relationship benefits both countries, and we need to do whatever we can do in order to ensure that all is not lost from the last 40 years of our relationship. But the point that you made, or I would say the points that you made, do not lead, at least in the short term, to a high level of optimism. It is rather pessimistic, but we'll get to that during the panel discussion. But why don't we go ahead and turn things over to Bob, for your remarks. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, and joining my two panelists. Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. So I'm supposed to talk about what's going to happen in the next 4 years, which, it's hard to be wrong because honestly, who knows what's going to happen. But I'll give you my best guess at it. So I would argue, and we argue, my colleague, my co-author Ling Wei, and I argue in our book Superpower Showdown that, the high point of U.S.-China relations was 2008. At that time, the two countries worked together first to set up the first leaders meeting of the group of 20 nations. Secondly, more importantly, to work together to pull the global economy out of a recession. A recession, let's remember, that was made in the USA. But at the same time, that was the moment, I think, where the relations started to go off key on both ends. On the U.S. side, it was a moment where disillusionment started to creep into it. A fear on the business community that China was predator when it came to its technology, that Beijing wouldn't really let U.S. companies operate in the way that they wanted. A growing realization that the policies of engagement that had been in place at least since the early Clinton years after the Tiananmen Square killings, that the engagement wasn't going to lead to democracy and political liberalization like many in the U.S. wanted, increasing pressure over human rights in China, and just a fear of being overtaken in the United States, a fear of being overtaken by a powerful Chinese economy that would become a powerful military rival, and disillusionment on the Chinese side as well. 2008 was a lesson that you can't rely on the United States, that the model for economic development, the U.S. was never a political model, but an economic model really wasn't working out. a fear of being encircled, and just this sort of sense that the policies of relying on the U.S., counting on the U.S., really weren't working out. I mean, derailment, obviously, what we call derailment, obviously got a huge boost under President Trump. And what I would say is it's kind of a weird thing, but at this moment, the thing holding the U.S.-China relationship together is trade policy, the trade deal, where that was what the U.S. and China were basically fighting about for the past 2 years. It is a very limited phase one deal, very limited, but it's all they got. And now that the relationship has moved into questions of national security, questions of human rights, the election, in a very odd way, President Trump in his administration has become the moderate on these sorts of issues. He cares deeply, deeply about the economic issues and trade issues, and not so much on the others. So, I mean, what we talk about in the book is you have a blue-collar Trump who cares about the sort of working class issues that he ran on, and a Wall Street Trump who cares enormously about the way the markets are reacting, the way the economy is moving, particularly with the COVID crisis. And on national security and human rights issues, it's Wall Street Trump. It's still the sort of sense that you can't let this stuff get out of hand. So, okay, so one of these two, Trump and Biden, are going to be elected on November of this year. So let's take a look first at a Trump reelection. So what would one expect from a reelected President Trump? Well, first of all, Trump, I think, as Amy pointed out, will certainly tout, and Bill also, will certainly tout the phase one deal. I mean, his basic campaign pitches, I was the only one who was smart enough, tough enough to get China to make these concessions. I think actually it's going to, the deal itself will be a major part, an important part of the campaign, because what he'll talk about is not the intellectual property provisions or the dispute resolution mechanism. He's going to talk about purchases. You know, I got $200 billion worth of new stuff coming in from China. Democrats could never get that. They won't actually get $200 billion. I'd be astonished, absolutely astonished. But there'll be more. You know, there'll be more purchases. I think Beijing will try to get out of the way of the election as best they can. And one way to get out of the way is to make sure that the purchases at least are increasing and give Trump something that he can brag about, and also not give him an incentive to pull away from the deal, because that's another option. I mean, it is literally impossible to imagine what Trump will do. So, I mean, if it's in October and he's down 10 points and he wants something, you know, to rally the folks with, he could pull out of that deal in a second and say that, you know, they didn't live up to it. I told you I'm going to be tough on China. You know, Joe Biden will never have the guts to pull out of a deal. I will. So either you're dealing with a phase one deal, which maybe will last until the election, but the chances of a phase two deal under President Trump, I think, are minimal, very minimal, because the issues that are remaining are ones that go to the core of Chinese economic policy, the way state-owned enterprises operate, the role of subsidies, the role of the government, the role of the party, all these things, China has no incentive to make concessions on. So I think I think on the trade part, you know, the outlook under Trump is probably for more tariffs, I would say, but unlikely to get very much more, I would say, you know, in a liberalizing fashion on trade. And so then you're left with the other issues. You're left with human rights. You're left with Hong Kong. You're left with Xinjiang. You're left with Taiwan. I mean, these are going to be. These are very, very tough issues, much, much more difficult than the trade issue, which again consumed almost 3 years of that administration. And there, as I say, I think you would find that Trump would be the moderating influence on that. He has, the way we look at it is he has people that work in that White House who think China is an existential threat. who think China is the greatest threat to the United States since the rise of fascism in the 1930s. But he's not one of them. And when Trump says, the European Union's a bigger threat, a bigger problem than China, he means it. When he says, the chairman of the Federal Reserve is a bigger problem than China, he means that too. His lens of looking at China is mercantilist. It is exports minus imports. How much stuff are they buying? So you have that wing, China is the greatest threat since the rise of Nazism. And then you also have, the wing that says, yeah, China's a problem. It's definitely an issue, but there's a lot of issues in the global economy, and particularly with a, COVID-induced pandemic, COVID-induced recession around the globe. It's important not to let things go off the rails too much. And he's not in that camp either. So he goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So I think what you would see is a constant threats, endless threats about national security, human rights. But I think it would not go, I don't think it would go to the extreme of, say, with Hong Kong, cutting off Chinese banks from the US financial system. That would be a powerful, powerful sanction. That is the way the United States treats Iran. I don't see that happening under President Trump, a second term President Trump, because what would happen, the markets would go crazy, and he cares about what happens with the markets. And it would tank an already, unbelievably weak economy. So I don't see that's happening. I think, and also in a sort of odd way, that administration, a second Trump term, would become more multilateral when it comes to China, because again, these issues that we're talking about, human rights, national security, are issues on which the Western alliance, tattered as it is, still agrees. I think, an indication of that was when you saw the UK back away from using Huawei equipment and its network. That was a full court press by the administration. The European Union countries are looking at it as well. There is a general recognition that China poses a national security threat. I think that's getting more widely seen across Europe and certainly in Japan. So I think in an odd way, you'd see this administration, which is focused enormously on unilateralism, America first, moving in a more multilateral direction, although on some very, very difficult issues. So, okay, so let's say Biden wins, which at the moment looks way more likely, but we're still quite a ways from the election. I mean, you'd certainly have a softer tone, without a doubt. I mean, there's rhetoric, Xi Jinping's the heir to Joseph Stalin, China as an existential threat. I think that would fade away. But so assume you're Joe Biden, you've come into office, you inherit tariffs on 3/4 of everything China sends to the US, substantial tariffs on that. You as a politician who, and I agree with Amy, I mean, it's going to be, Biden's going to get, hammer on China as much as Trump is. I mean, nobody's going to be China's friend during this election, to say the least. I mean, you're not going to just say, okay, fine, fine, let's just roll those tariffs back. I mean, to the degree he might experiment with rolling back tariffs, I think it's way, way, way more likely that he tries that out with steel tariffs on Europe. Because those are, A, they're, assessed against an ally, and B, there are a lot of steel-using companies that are hurting because of those tariffs. And the steel producers, one could argue, have had 3 years to get their stuff together. The tariffs under a Biden administration, I don't think would be a go-to tactic as they are under a Trump administration. But it's hard to imagine what China would be able to offer that would induce a Biden administration to roll back those tariffs. I mean, certainly he's not going to talk about, hasn't talked about so far, probably won't talk about what he's going to do on the tariff question during the campaign. They say they're going to have a process, whatever that means. but it's basically a punt. In the same way, they're going to punt, I believe, on whether or not the U.S. would rejoin the TPP, whatever it's called these days. Biden said during the primary that he would do that as a way to, mount pressure, multilateral pressure on China, but he never gave any details. And now his policy is no trade deals until we strengthen the middle class. Well, that just means, I think, that, becoming the U.S. trade rep under a Biden administration is going to be a pretty boring job, for at least for a couple of years, as it was in the first couple of years in the Obama administration, let's remember. But I think also you'd see much more effort, much more emphasis on multilateralism, whether through a, renewed TPP or some other effort. Biden administration has talked about rejoining the Paris Accord on climate change, rejiggering, I think, rejiggering or rejoining, but yeah, basically rejoining the Iran nuclear pact. All those sorts of efforts will require cooperation with China. So I think you'd pull back generally from the tone. You'd have more multilateral pressure, but more multilateral pressure on China, but also because of the desire to rejoin other multilateral efforts, some kind of opening toward China. But I don't think, getting back to 2008, I don't think that this will substantially change the direction of U.S.-China relations, which are toward what I would call derailment, the two countries separating and going their own ways. Not a full decoupling. I think that's kind of a fantasy, but movement in different directions. So I'll stop there, and we can turn to discussion and questions.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And I think you certainly provided us some, plenty to think about. And in particular, I know what's on top of many people's minds, whether it be in China or US or elsewhere, is really just projecting forward. If Trump is reelected, or if, Biden is elected, what is this? What are the ramifications? What are the implications, for the US-China relationships? Look forward to getting into that in more detail. I also, I found your point that the high point in the relationship was really in 2008. Well, that's actually 12 years ago. And at least the sense on the ground here is like, well, things really started to go off the rails, maybe 3-4 years ago, or, in a way after Trump was elected. But this will be interested to pick up on, what were the undercurrents, really even from 2008, that we should be concerned about. But why don't I go ahead and field a few questions on behalf of our members and scholars that kind of provided questions, to us in advance. And maybe I'll spend about no more than 15 minutes on that, and then we'll have the rest of the period here for question and answer. So I think one of the questions is really about COVID-19. And while I think all of you, alluded to or spoke to it, in some respects, at the end of the day, COVID-19 and the impact that it has had on the economy, on, U.S. society and so on, is significant. And the certainly, President Trump's, narrative that, this, emanated from China, it's the Wuhan virus, et cetera. That the question really is, to what extent is COVID-19 in particular, going to be a swing factor in terms of who voters vote for? And maybe Bill, would you like to start off with that one? And then, by the way, our three panelists, all feel free to respond to this and, jump in, and you don't have to agree with one another either. I think one of the great, institutions of America is open debate. So I hope that we can have some of that this evening too.
Well, thank you, Alan. I think the election issue is not, I think the question of, whose fault is it? And let's blame China. I think that fades with time. The issue in the election, because the Democrats will make an issue, is the president's handling of the recovery process. And that really will be a question of, it'll be a domestic question. I mean, you can have this sort of, it'll become kind of an academic argument about, is this China's fault? Should they have done more in the beginning? Should they have done more in the middle? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. We'll have that debate. The real question for voters is going to be, are we still in this mess? If we are, and if we're still in this mess, why are we still in this mess? And the Democrats are of course, going to say, as they've already begun to say, that the president has handled the process horribly, that there's been no national policy, and that the recent spike of cases, particularly in our South, various states in the South, has been due to the lack of a federal policy, mixed messages from the federal government, contrary advice, contradicting the scientific and health authorities. That is what I think the political issue will be, and it'll be, the Democrats will phrase it as a question of overall competence. That the president is not competent to deal with large issues, and this is an example. And I think China as a factor in that is going to fade over time.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. Bob or Amy, thoughts?
I don't think China's going to fade as an issue. I mean, I think, for
no, I didn't mean as an issue on COVID. I think it's going to fade as a
no,
cause.
I think that I don't think so. I don't think the Biden people are going to wrap China around by Trump's head, and they're going to say, he said he was great on China. He said he was tough on China. Well, look what he did. He took a trade deal instead of paying attention on COVID. It wasn't. He missed the big opportunity. I think they're going to pound that and pound that and pound that. And I think from the Trump perspective, they're going to continue to pound that it's the China virus. That they will all but accuse China, or maybe actually accuse China, of literally unleashing the virus to bring down the United States. I think it's going to get unbelievably nasty, and COVID and China are, I think, inextricably linked for both of those campaigns.
I just want to say I agree with Bob on this. I agree with Bill that that the Democrats won't necessarily make it all about China, but President Trump's response to we have a COVID problem is going to be to shift. And it's not just about COVID. He'll then say the unfairness of China is what's really impacting our economy, not just COVID. So unfortunately, I think that's why I'm so incredibly downbeat. And even the press conference in the Rose Garden, while purportedly it was about announcing the Hong Kong Autonomy Act and the executive order, he then it was a campaign speech. And so I do think President Trump is linking China to COVID. And I really do agree with Bill that the Democrats are going to focus on President Trump failed on COVID. American voters should not vote for this guy who failed us when other countries have dealt with this issue better. But I just think the response from the Trump campaign is going to be, it's not my fault, it's China's fault.
No, I agree with that. He'll blame China because he's got nothing else. I mean, he can't really say, I'm competent and I've managed this well, if we're in the middle of the crisis. So of course he'll do that. I think that's right.
Alan, can I jump in here?
Please, Julia.
Because it's related. This is very discouraging and very pessimistic all around. But is there really going to be any difference with respect to our China policy if Biden wins? Because what I'm hearing is that the demonizing of China will continue. And we know that historically or traditionally, China bashing is common in our elections. I mean, do you remember Bill Clinton calling China the butchers of Beijing? So do you think that there will be a change in terms of performance or behavior once the president or once the candidate is elected? Because that's what has happened in the past. So is there any any hope that when either Trump or Biden wins, that in office they will act a little bit differently towards China?
If I can respond to that first, I think that, I mean, Bob had the key to that. I think what you get is a difference in tone if Biden wins. You're not going to get the bullying, the bluster, the rhetoric. You're going to get a policy that is less volatile, more predictable, and I think more clearly thought out. That doesn't mean it's going to be a different policy in many respects. It will continue to be a hard line. I don't think that public opinion is going to permit anything else, but it will be more restrained. Now, the other difference, and you alluded to Clinton, and that's a good analogy. The other difference is the Democrats will always put more of an emphasis on human rights issues than the Republicans will, and I think Bob explained the difference about that very clearly. That's the way the Clinton administration began, in saying that we're not going to deal with Beijing because of their human rights issues. That lasted about a year, and Clinton abandoned that policy because it was not getting them anywhere, and the relationship was too important to allow that to block all the other things that they needed to discuss. That'll happen to Biden too. They'll come in and say that, and he'll say that the Uyghur situation is unacceptable, which it is. Hong Kong is unacceptable. But the reality is, the two countries have to deal with each other on climate change, on Iran, on the South China Sea, on a whole host of issues where we butt heads, and you can't sacrifice the whole relationship because you're unhappy with one particular element of it. So, there will be a learning process, and they'll get over the hump. But also keep in mind something else that Bob said that I think is very important. When the voters don't understand this, but when they elect a president, they don't just elect Donald Trump or Joe Biden. They elect the 5,000 people that guy's going to appoint as political appointees, as the ambassadors, and all the various officials. And it has been an abiding truth in this country that in both parties in the executive branch, in both parties on the Hill, in academia, and in journalism, there are a substantial number of people who believe that China is an existential threat. In fairness, there are a good number of people in China that believe exactly the same thing about the United States. And I've thought for a long time the best policy to pursue is to make sure that those guys never end up in charge. And if Bob is right, that's what we got right now, somebody who is not in that camp. But there's a lot of people in the White House, he's exactly right, who are in that camp. And there will be people from the left that Biden will bring in that will be in that camp as well. And there will be always a debate inside any administration on this. Sorry for the rant.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could pick up on a question here on behalf of the AmCham China business community, which is, of course, in business, we're in the business of business, and part of that is contingency planning. So if our panelists could provide perspectives on either scenario, if whether it's Trump or Biden that wins this upcoming election, what does it mean for business? And more specifically, what should we be planning on as we, go into 2021?
I think
or preparing for?
I think one of the challenges is that if President Trump is reelected, I really agree with Bob. In many ways, that is better for the commercial relationship because he really does have mercantilist policies and so won't promote a full decoupling. But the uncertainty of what will he do is going to be increasingly pressing on the business community. And so we just can't live with that. And so unfortunately, I think if this uncertainty is perpetuated into 2021 and beyond, companies, of course, have to deal with that through diversification. And as we're already seeing, of course, China strategy, but I do think that lack of certainty is going to be very damaging for normalizing any kind of continued business relationships in China. we want to stay in China. We want to continue to grow our presence and deal with the very real issues in the trading relationship. But I think without a clear strategy and knowing where are the red lines in the relationship, it will be very difficult to do in a second-term Trump administration. On the other hand, in a Biden administration, I think where I try to derive a sliver of optimism is that while I agree with Bill, there are going to be members of the administration who are going to really push with other countries to pressure China on human rights issues and other issues. But I do think we'll probably see a return to a professionalism that will focus not only on national security problems, but truly American competitiveness. And so I'm seeing that. And the reason I'm saying that is we are seeing bipartisan support in Congress for legislation, for example, in the semiconductor industry that deals with the fact that maybe we do need to really invest in industrial policy in the United States if we're going to compete with China. But it's trying to work with industry there. And so because we're going to be in a significant recession in 2021, I think the challenge for all of us in a Biden administration is, will we have the money to invest this way? But I do think, if I'm trying to be optimistic, despite the fact that the relationship will never go back to where it once was, and it will be defined by rivalry and competition, I think there are areas where a Biden administration will say, climate change, global pandemics, non-proliferation, we need to cooperate with China. And so we have to have a more professional, comprehensive relationship. That's got to include some business issues. And so again, for the business community, I think that's what I'm waiting to see, if Congress and a Biden administration will push in that direction to return to some normalcy so we can plan.
If I could
Thanks, Amy.
I'm less optimistic on that. I think that Amy's strategy is exactly the right one. With clear strategy and clear red lines is important. That's what my advice to companies is, which they ignore, has been that pretty much. I think the dilemma for a lot of companies in China is that China is simultaneously their best customer and their biggest threat.
Yeah.
And they know both. And they don't know what to do, because biggest threat may mean, depending on their business model and depending on what they're doing and where their IP is and how important their IP is, their best answer may be to leave. But that would mean abandoning their best customer, and they can't bring themselves to do that. That's their dilemma. And that's not going to get any better. It doesn't matter who the president is. Economics are going to drive us apart. I mean, if you talk about decoupling, I mean, I think Bob is right that that's not going to happen to the degree that people sometimes talk about. But I mean, the Chinese have said their policy is the Americans are unreliable. We need to go it alone. You're going to see them pulling away, and you're going to see us doing the same thing. And in the middle of that, companies need to have a very clear understanding of why they are there, what the point of being there is for them, what red lines they're unwilling to cross because the Chinese government is going to push them, and what are the terms that will cause them to leave. And they need to have a plan B to enable themselves to do that if they reach that point.
One thing that we're not talking about, which is, an enormous question mark as to how everything's going to turn out, is it's not just whoever wins at the White House. It's not just Biden or Trump's, policies. It's like, what will China do? It's 2021, right? So will there be overtures? Will they make, overtures in terms of trying to get rid of the tariffs or get a phase 2, anything of that sort? Or will they go the opposite way? I mean, they made some overtures, minor overtures to the Trump administration. They wined and dined them in Beijing. They made some, they repackaged some offers on financial services and making it easier for U.S. companies to do business in China. It wasn't nearly enough, but they tried to some degree. Or will it be confrontations? I mean, whoever wins, will they do something, provocative when it comes to Taiwan? What about the South China Sea? I mean, it's not just in the hands of the White House. It is in the hands of Beijing equally. So, I mean, I think we just have to keep that in mind.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let's turn to the formal Q&A session here, and the chat box is overflowing here with questions. I don't know that we'll have a chance to get to all of them in our remaining time, which is, I believe, around 15 more minutes, if that's, if I'm correct. But why don't I go ahead and start fielding a few. And one is actually related to TikTok. So I thought that was a sort of an interesting one. The question is that, it's said that Trump is thinking about kicking TikTok out of the US, and some are arguing that it's because TikTok is one of the reasons for his poor performance at the Tulsa rally. So what are your views on, I guess, TikTok specifically, but, maybe more generally would be, technology companies such as WeChat and, that are in the private sector. Of course, we all know about Huawei, but others, and what that may look like, or how that may unfold in the future.
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat box, and I thought it was a very interesting question. It had never occurred to me that would be the reason why he would do it, and that would be typical Trump. Say, well, they stiffed me at the rally, so I'm going to get even. I suspect it's deeper than that, and I think the impetus for it is coming from the same people that were concerned about Huawei and the same people that were concerned about ZTE. There is, a growing mountain of evidence on two fronts. One, that these are technologies that have back doors, if you will, that can be made available to security forces. And there's I think a growing mountain of evidence that the Chinese government is not hesitant to demand that kind of access. So it doesn't surprise me that companies that are in that business are going to be subject to these kinds of attacks. I mean, the Indians have already gone down this road. Maybe that has more to do with the clashes on the border, I suppose, in the short run. But there's a security rationale for these things that is not a fantasy, and that needs to be taken into account.
And I think that either in a second Trump term or a Biden administration, this concept of reciprocity isn't going away. And so it is easier, I think, for President Trump or a President Biden to say, why should we continue to allow TikTok, given these national security concerns that we have, but also the overriding issue of our social media companies are not allowed in China. And so I think that's an easier, less sensitive way to restrict technology companies in the United States. And it's certainly an issue that has a lot of support, I think, on Capitol Hill, as well as in both campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reciprocity issue is an interesting one. Reciprocity when it comes to, whether American Express can be in China when, if American Express can expand in China easily when a Chinese company can do the same here, sure, that's fine. But I mean, under this administration, the reciprocity is extended to things that are just losers. The back and forth of kicking out journalists has just been a terrible mistake. I mean, you're dealing there with a regime that has no tradition of freedom of the press, doesn't really care if there are foreign reporters there at this point, and we're winding up just with fewer and fewer foreign reporters. It's just been a disaster. And I mean, I think there is a question. I understand the question on TikTok. Certainly, they collect lots of data, as does Facebook, right? I mean, everything that you do will be collected. It is a legitimate issue. There is, I think we should be thinking also, though, I don't know if it's literally a First Amendment issue. I don't know what kind of rights a foreign company has in terms of, those sorts of things. But there are a lot of Americans who like TikTok, right? And so what's the lesson there if we're banning, a social media operation. Yes, it's true Facebook, can't operate there, and Google and Twitter can't operate. I think we should be pushing more on getting access to those companies than restricting alternatives, social media alternatives.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question just relates to soft power. And the question is, or has the U.S. given up on soft power in relation to China? For example, why is the Fulbright program suspended? And yeah, Julia, I don't know if you may also have a perspective on that.
Well, we definitely have not suspended our soft power, but we're just doing it very badly. I mean, I've never seen any administration, an American administration, trying to completely restrict foreign students. I mean, the idea of even thinking about it, that's not the way to win hearts and minds, let alone the economic issues related to this. And for an administration to think about and to discuss it in the White House, that we should ban all Chinese students. Of course, that was rejected. And as Bob has said, Trump, I think, was persuaded. He became a moderating factor in the White House. No, we have not given up. But it's just that we are really, really shooting ourselves in the foot by many of the things we're doing. And I think possibly that may be one difference between how a Biden administration would move forward and the Trump administration, if there's another one going forward.
Great, thanks, Julia. And another question here from just as it relates to black swan events, whether that be related to Hong Kong, I guess South China Sea would add Taiwan, into that, where things spiral out of control in unexpected ways and exponentially. I guess two parts to this question is, what would be the probability of that occurring under the Trump versus Biden administration, and how should companies, whether in China or to the U.S., prepare for that? Or what can one do to prepare for things like that?
Well, I throw in one thing. I think if you look at this historically, the Chinese kind of have a history of testing a new president. If Biden comes in, I mean, he's not new because he's had a long career, but there is a tendency for the Chinese to think about, an incident in the South China Sea, think about jet fighters coming too close to each other, which was a George W. Bush case. The Chinese usually test the new person in some provocative way the first few months, just to see what he'll do. I'd expect that if Biden's elected. That has the chance of spiraling out of control or not. It has not in the past, but it's come close to it. Look for that. Otherwise, I don't think that who is president makes black swans more or less likely. That's something that comes in from the outside.
I agree with that. That last point in particular, I don't think we're looking at black swan events differently if it were in a Trump or a Biden administration. I would add to the list of black swans a change of leadership in Beijing, and I don't mean some overthrow. I mean, people, if there's illness or anything. So I don't know how much we're prepared for that either as a black swan, but on how to think about this, I would say because of the economic vulnerabilities that both the United States and China face right now, I do think domestic politics may temper some erratic behaviors because it could lead to further problems. And so I guess I'm inarticulately saying in 2021, it will be difficult for, I think, a test of a new administration, a President Biden without concern over what could the results be within mainland China if that test goes badly for China. It does result in conflict. I think the Chinese, for foreign investors in the market, I think we are seeing at least a little bit of brightness in that the Chinese government is really reinforcing the need for foreign investment to help with economic recovery right now. Of course, they just had great numbers coming out overnight about the recovery in China. And so anything that's going to damage that is very bad for the Chinese government. And so potentially that could limit black swans. But again, if we're talking about black swan planning, I think we should also add to that list if there's any changes in the leadership in China.
When I heard the
Thanks,
question, when I heard the question, I thought, how many black swan events can we stand? I mean, we have a pandemic sweeping across the world. You know, in the United States, we have the greatest protests over racial injustice in 50 years. It's like, and to Bill's point about, you know, if Beijing testing a new administration, God, that would be a mistake. I mean, Biden's whole raison d'etre is, let's get back to normal. Let's stop this. You know, let's just, you know, get back to normal in our lives. Let's not have to worry every time you go to sleep. And I think it would be enormously in Beijing's interest to operate in a different fashion, to sort of talk about things where they could work together, like on climate change, on healthcare, on a new vaccine, things of that sort, to be encouraging, because there is such a negative attitude toward China at this point.
Great. Well, thanks, Bob. And you know, I will say that, you know, at AmCham China, we have been running hundreds of webinars this year, and this one has gone. The time has flown. It's you know, we're on an hour and a half already. I think we could, you know, go for much longer, but I think just out of respect for everybody's time, we'll need to wrap things up here shortly. But there's Julia, what I might do is I'm going to pose a couple questions, but before the panelists answer, if there's other comments that you would like to make or another question you'd like to pose along with that, you know, as part of this wrap up. But one is one that I did prep, you know, our panelists on earlier, that you know, is a career in U.S.-China, is focusing on U.S.-China relations still a smart career choice? And then an unrelated question, but one I can't resist asking, is that if China could vote in this election, who would they vote for?
In the interest of time, your questions are perfect. The last one was something that I asked in our earlier election programs. I know in-person election programs, I used to ask the students, and they usually voted Democratic, by the way.
Okay.
I think I'll answer the second one, because I've asked, Alan, you may remember, I spoke to your group 3 weeks ago, and I asked your group that question. Who do the Chinese want to win, was the question.
Yeah.
And they all said the same thing. They all said the Chinese want Trump to win. And I've heard that here too, and for two reasons, which I thought were very interesting. One, they think they figured him out and know how to manage him. That may or may not be true, but that's what they think. And two, which fascinated me, is they think that the damage he's done to the Western alliance is greater than the damage he's done to them. And that works for China's advantage.
I think I'll take a contrary position to that and say what I've heard among, admittedly, people in China who work for foreign companies, you know, a Biden victory would be better because it would at least return us to some semblance of normalcy in the conduct of international affairs. Not that it's going to be a rosy, constructive engagement scenario between the United States and China, but I fully agree with what you said, Bill, for many of the reasons where maybe a Trump victory would be good for some Chinese interests. But I also think a Biden victory would be good for just stability in the world, which is in China's interest as well. But on the first, since I have, dedicated my professional life to work on China, and I've often thought of it as an iron rice bowl that I will time employment for working in China. I would encourage the younger generations to absolutely continue to study Chinese, study China, study the United States if you're in China, because it's only through these interactions that we're going to be able to get through a challenging time in the relationship. I would not turn your back on China. I would not be worried that there won't be issues to deal with. And so if you're in the United States, please start studying Chinese, and from Beijing, please continue to study the United States, because this relationship is going to continue to be critical, even if it's going to be defined quite differently going forward.
Well, I'll tackle the career advice with the caveat that I encourage young people to go into journalism still. So it may not be the most practical advice. But what I tell my kids, and what I still believe, is follow your heart. If you think US-China issues are really interesting, study them, right? I mean, if that's what you want to do with your life, that's what you should want to do with your life. And don't worry so much about your career advancement and, plotting one step after another. Do something you find interesting.
I agree with both, but I would add only one other thing, and that is, regardless of the US-China relationship, China will always matter in the next century.
For the definitive answer to this question comes from a movie that probably most of you have not seen. The movie's called Looper, and it's about going back into the past. And at one point, the hero in the movie says that he wants to move to Paris. He's studying French because he wants to move to Paris and work there. And the guy who's his boss, who has come from the future back into the past, says, "Trust me, I come from the future. Study Chinese. Don't study."
All right. So, well, on that note, I think we're on the hour, Julia, but, would you like to wrap things up here for us this evening?
I think we should do another one, and we are planning to do another one on polarization and nationalism. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. I think, we could probably have a 2.5-hour webinar on that topic.
I don't think anybody will stay for 2.5 hours.
Well, if we start earlier.
Oh,
all right.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much, the speakers. Really,
Absolutely. Really. Yeah, no, Bill, Amy, and Bob, you did a wonderful job this evening. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Always happy to do it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.